Imagine you're standing by a calm sea. The waves roll gently onto the shore. The wind brushes softly against your face, and everything around you gradually grows still. It was right here, on a distant island, that a boy once lived who loved to gaze into the distance and dream. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He didn't yet know that one day he would become one of the most famous people in history. For now, he simply listened to the sound of the waves, felt the warm air, and imagined what his future might hold. This story isn't just about battles and victories. It's a story about a journey, dreams, and quiet moments that stay with a person forever. Get comfortable. Close your eyes, and let's set off on this peaceful journey together. Imagine an early morning on an island. The sun is just beginning to lift itself above the horizon. Not dramatically, not with the sudden declaration of light that happens in other places, but gradually, the way things happen on islands, where time moves at its own pace, and the world seems to understand that rushing serves no purpose. The sky changes from deep blue to something softer, then to pink, then to the particular shade of gold that exists only in that first hour and cannot be reproduced at any other time of day. The air is still cool. It carries the salt of the sea. And underneath that, something greener, the smell of the hillside grasses, of wild herbs that grow between the rocks, of morning dew on stone that has been warm all night and is only now beginning to release its heat. It is the smell of a specific place, a smell you would recognize if you had grown up here, that would follow you for the rest of your life as the smell of home, of before. This is Corsica. And on this particular morning, in a house not far from the water, a boy woke up before everyone else. He woke the way he always did, quietly and completely, with none of the gradual surfacing that sleep requires of most people. One moment he was somewhere else, and the next he was here, in his room, in the early dark, listening to the silence of a house still sleeping. He did not lie there, waiting for the day to begin. He got up carefully, moved without sound across the cool floor, and went to the window. Beyond the hills, the sea was just becoming visible, a darker darkness against the lightening sky, its surface smooth at this hour, barely moving, as though it too had just woken and had not yet decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Napoleon stood at the window for a long time. This was something he did not share with anyone. Not because it was secret, but because it belonged to this hour, and this hour belonged only to him. In a house full of brothers and sisters, full of noise and conversation, and the ordinary friction of family life. These early morning minutes were the only time the world was entirely quiet and entirely his. He was not thinking about anything in particular. This was part of what he loved about it, the absence of the need to think about anything in particular. During the day, there were always things to consider, problems to engage with, people to respond to. But in the early morning, standing at the window with the sea still grey and the sky beginning to change above it, He allowed himself to simply look, to take the world in without having to do anything about it. The colors shifted. Pink appeared at the horizon, tentative at first, then more certain. Gold followed, not all at once, but in the way that gold arrives, slowly, and then everywhere. He watched until the light was full enough. Then he went outside. The stone path was cool beneath his feet, still holding the temperature of the night, which in summer lingered longer than you'd expect, the stone giving back the coolness it had taken from the dark hours. His footsteps were quiet on the familiar surface. He had walked this path so many times that his feet knew it without guidance, knew where the uneven stone was, where it turned, where the grass began. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible, came the sounds of fishermen beginning their day, the particular sounds of early morning labor, ropes, wood, water, carried clearly in the still air before the day's noise filled in around them. These were the sounds of the island's ordinary life, the life that went on every day, regardless of weather or season or anything else, the life that the sea required of the people who lived beside it. Napoleon walked toward the hill. It was not a large hill, nothing dramatic, nothing that would command attention from a distance. But from its top, you could see the sea in 3 directions, and on clear mornings, you could see far enough that the horizon looked like something you could almost reach if you walked long enough in the right direction. He had come here so often that it had become his in the way that children claim places, not by ownership, but by repeated presence, by the accumulation of hours spent in a single spot, until the spot begins to feel like an extension of yourself. He sat down on the grass, pulled his knees to his chest, and looked out. The sea below was beginning to catch the light. Small waves moved across its surface, unhurried, consistent, each one following the last, with the patient regularity of something that has been doing this since long before there were people to watch it, and will continue long after. There is a particular comfort in watching the sea at this hour, a comfort that has nothing to do with thought or intention. The waves come and go. They always have. Whatever else is uncertain, this continues. He watched for a long time. Sometimes, sitting on this hill, thoughts came that were different from his ordinary thoughts. Not the thoughts of lessons, or family matters, or the small negotiations of daily life with brothers and sisters, who each had their own needs and opinions and claims on the shared space of the house. These other thoughts were larger and less defined, more like feelings that had taken on the approximate shape of ideas. He would look at the horizon and think about what lay beyond it. Not in the worried way, not with urgency, more as a kind of wondering, the wondering that happens when you are young, and the world still has the quality of being mostly unknown, mostly unexplored, mostly still to be encountered. He knew in the abstract way that one knows things from books and maps, that beyond the horizon there were other islands, other coasts, other cities, places with their own hills and their own mornings, their own people going about their own ordinary lives. But knowing this in the abstract was different from feeling it. From his hill on Corsica, feeling it meant the world is very large, and I am a small part of it, and I do not yet know what my part will be. This thought was not frightening to him. It was simply large. He held it the way you hold something large, carefully, with both hands, aware of its weight without being crushed by it. Sometimes he imagined himself elsewhere, in great cities he had read about but not seen, whose streets existed for him only as names on maps and descriptions in books. Sometimes he imagined himself leading men somewhere, though where and why and toward what were details that the imagination left conveniently unspecified. Sometimes he imagined himself simply walking through places he had never been, looking at things he had never seen, carrying inside him the particular quality of attention that characterized his best moments on this hill. But most often, he did not imagine himself anywhere else at all. Most often, he simply dreamed. Without haste, without destination, in the way that is only possible when you are young and the future is not yet pressing, when it exists as a horizon rather than a schedule, when there is still time for the kind of open, directionless wondering that later life gradually crowds out. He loved books. This had been true for as long as he could remember, longer, perhaps, than anything else he knew about himself. Not all books equally. He was less drawn to the ones that told him what to think than to the ones that showed him things he hadn't seen. Maps fascinated him most of all. The way they made the world legible. The way a line on a page could represent a coastline you had never visited. A name could stand for a city you had never walked through. He would trace the lines with his finger and follow them to their edges. Every line was a road. Every name was a world that existed somewhere, whether he ever reached it or not. The maps made the largeness of the world concrete in a way that conversation or description could not quite manage. You could see the distances, measure the proportions, understand in a physical way how much existed beyond the small circle of your own experience. He found this more exciting than frightening. The history books he read gave him something different. Not the geography of the world, but its depth. The sense that the present moment was sitting on top of an enormous accumulation of other moments, each of which had once been just as immediate, just as real, just as fully inhabited as this one. People had stood on their own hills, looking at their own horizons, wondering their own versions of the same questions. They had lived through events that had seemed to them as large and uncertain as anything felt large and uncertain now. And their lives had turned out to be something, had mattered, had shaped what came after, had become the past that he was now reading about. What would become the past that someone else would someday read? He did not ask this question with ambition. He asked it with curiosity, the same curiosity with which he traced the lines on maps. Not because he intended to end up on those pages, but because the question was interesting. because the world was interesting, and the way it accumulated history was interesting, and the way any single life could unexpectedly become part of that accumulation was interesting. He put the book down and looked out the window. The sea was still there. During the day, the house was full. There were many of them, brothers, sisters, the particular organized chaos of a large family, in a house that accommodated it by making everyone slightly too aware of everyone else. It was loud sometimes, and fun sometimes, and occasionally exhausting. And underneath all of it was the fundamental warmth of people who belong to each other, who share a table and a name, and the accumulated experience of years of daily life together. He was not separate from this. He was part of it, fully, genuinely. He argued with his brothers and laughed with his sisters, and participated in the ordinary life of the family with the same completeness he brought to everything. But even in the middle of it, there was a part of him that remained its own, a part that was watching as well as participating, that was taking note of things as well as experiencing them. He had always been this way. It was not distance. It was the particular kind of attention that coexists with full engagement, that is present in the moment, and simultaneously aware of the moment from the outside. He did not think of this as unusual. It was simply how he was. Evening came slowly, the way evenings come on islands in summer, reluctantly, the light lasting longer than seems reasonable, the sky holding color long after the sun has technically gone. He returned to the hill. The sea below had changed with the hour, deeper in color now, the surface catching the last light differently than it had in the morning, the waves casting small shadows that hadn't been there before. The hills behind him had gone gold, then amber, then a deep reddish color that made the stone walls of the houses glow as though lit from within. He lay on his back in the grass. Above him, the sky was making its slow transition, blue deepening toward something darker, the first stars appearing at the edges, tentative at first, testing the light, then more of them, and more, until the whole sky was doing what the sky does on clear island nights, which is to become so full of stars that the spaces between them seem to shrink, seem almost solid with accumulated light. He lay there for a long time. In moments like this, something happened that he could not quite have described to anyone, but that he recognized when it came. A feeling of scale, of the world being very large and himself being very small within it, but the smallness not mattering, or rather mattering in a different way than it usually seems to matter. The sky was full of stars that had been burning for longer than human beings had existed. The sea below had been moving for the same duration. Everything around him was operating on a time scale that made individual human lives seem brief, almost beyond comprehension. And yet, individual human lives were the only things that noticed any of this. The stars didn't know they were being watched. The sea didn't know it was being listened to. Only he, lying in the grass on this small hill, on this small island, was here to receive all of it, to take it in and find it beautiful, and be moved by it in ways he didn't have words for. That seemed important, though he couldn't have said why. He closed his eyes. The sound of the sea came more clearly this way. Without the visual information competing for attention, the sound expanded, filled the space, became the primary fact of the moment. It was a sound he had heard every day of his life, so familiar it usually passed unregistered, like the sound of one's own heartbeat. But when he listened to it deliberately, it resolved into something more complex. The approach of each wave different from the last. The retreat, the pause, the approach again. Constant, patient, indifferent to the fact of being heard. The wind moved through the grass around him. He could feel it on his face, cooler now than it had been during the day, carrying the salt that the island air always carried, closer to the sea at this hour than it seemed during the heat of the afternoon. His thoughts slowed. This too was something that happened only at this hour, on this hill, in this particular quality of silence. During the day his mind moved quickly, from one thing to the next, following threads, making connections, always in motion. He did not experience this as exhausting. It was simply how his mind worked, had always worked. But here, in the evening, lying in the grass under the stars, something released. The motion slowed. The thoughts became less frequent and less insistent. The spaces between them grew longer. He breathed. The world breathed around him. And somewhere in the gathering dark of a Corsican summer night, on a small hill above a sea that had existed long before him and would exist long after, a boy lay in the grass and let the island hold him. Let the sound of the waves and the feeling of the cool air and the particular weight of the dark sky fill in around the edges of his awareness, until there was very little awareness left. Only the sea and the wind and the stars and the slow, even rhythm of breath. He did not know what lay ahead. He could not have known. The paths that would take him from this hill to places whose names would be repeated for centuries, the battles, the decisions, the rise and the fall, and the long exile, and everything in between. None of it was visible from here. None of it was even imaginable in its specific form, though perhaps the shape of it, the broad outline of a life lived at a particular scale, was already somehow present in the way he looked at horizons, in the way he traced map lines with his finger, in the way he lay under stars and did not feel small so much as correctly proportioned, the right size for a world that was the right size for the things that happened in it. But that was later. All of that was later. Right now, there was only the evening. This island, this hill and this grass, and this particular arrangement of stars above a sea that had been moving since before there were names for things. And a boy lying in it all, breathing slowly, dreaming of nothing specific and everything in general. The way you dream when you are young, and the world is still mostly ahead of you, and the future has not yet become the present. And there is still time, still so much time, for the kind of open, wondering stillness that later life cannot always afford. The island breathed around him. The stars continued their long, indifferent burning. The sea came and went. And somewhere in this quiet, in the space between one wave and the next, in the pause between one thought and the thought that followed it, in the long, unhurried dark of a summer night on a small island in the Mediterranean, a life was gathering itself, slowly, and without knowing it was doing so, for everything that was to come. But that would be later. For now, only this. The warm stone of the hillside, the cool air, the distant sound of water, and a boy who had not yet become anything, who was still, for a little while longer, simply himself, simply here, simply watching the world be the world, eyes closing, breath slowing, the island lulling him toward sleep. Imagine a morning, but not on a warm island. France. The air here is different. Cooler, for one thing. Not the soft warmth of a Mediterranean morning. Not the salt and herbs and particular aliveness of island air. This air is cleaner, more austere, carrying the smell of stone and old wood, and the particular quality of light that comes through tall, narrow windows in buildings designed for purpose rather than comfort. It is not unpleasant. It is simply different. And different when you are 10 years old and far from everything you have known, can feel very large. Napoleon had arrived at Brienne-le-Château in the autumn of 1779. He had crossed the water, traveled through unfamiliar country, arrived in an unfamiliar town, and been delivered to an institution whose purpose was to make soldiers, or at least to make the kind of young men from whom soldiers could eventually be made. The military academy was organized, disciplined, precise, in the way that institutions designed around hierarchy and order tend to be precise. Everything happened at its appointed time. The days had shape, and the shape did not vary. He stood in his first days there, and listened to people speak, and understood, with a clarity that was uncomfortable, that he was not quite following everything. The French they spoke here was faster than what he had grown up with, more idiomatic, carrying the particular rhythms of mainland life that he had encountered mostly in books rather than in conversation. Sometimes a sentence passed him before he had fully assembled its meaning. This was a new experience. He did not like it. But he did not show that he didn't like it. Instead, he became quiet, not withdrawn, quiet. There is a difference, though it is sometimes invisible from the outside. He was present in every room he occupied, attentive to every conversation, tracking everything that happened around him, with the same steady attention he had given to the sea from his hill in Corsica. He simply did not speak until he was certain of his words. And in that silence, he watched. The academy had its routines, and he learned them the way you learn any unfamiliar landscape, by moving through it repeatedly, until the features become familiar, until what was strange becomes simply the way things are. Morning. The sharp sound of a bell in the cold air, the particular discipline of a shared space coming to order. Classes through the morning, mathematics, history, the technical subjects that military education required. Afternoons of exercise and drills, the body learning what the mind was simultaneously being asked to learn. Precision, control, the subordination of impulse to intention. Evenings were different. Evenings were when the institution relaxed its grip slightly, when the required activities gave way to something more personal, when each person could, within the limits of the place, be somewhat more themselves. For many of the boys, this meant games, conversation, the social navigation of dormitory life. For Napoleon, it meant something else. Books. He had always read. But here, reading became something more essential than it had been on Corsica, where the sea and the hills and the particular freedom of island life had offered alternatives. Here, in a stone building in the French interior, books were a world you could enter when the world available to you felt insufficient. They were a form of travel for someone who could not travel, a form of solitude in a place where you were never technically alone. He would find his corner in the evening, when the light outside had faded, and the candle on the table became the primary source of illumination, and he would read with the concentration of someone for whom reading is not a leisure activity, but a necessity. The candle gave a warm, slightly unsteady light that moved across the pages as the flame responded to air currents he couldn't feel. The pages had a particular sound when turned, soft, like a whispered word. And the smell of old books, slightly musty and organic, was by now as familiar as any smell he knew. He read about great commanders, not exclusively, and not always with explicit intention. Sometimes he simply followed his curiosity through whatever the library offered. But the histories of military men drew him back consistently. Not for the battles themselves, not for the drama of combat, but for something more interior, the decisions. The moments before action, when a commander sat with incomplete information and the necessity of choosing, when the future hung undecided, and the weight of choosing fell on one person's judgment. He tried to imagine what those moments felt like from the inside. Not the glory that histories tended to emphasize, not the victories that defined how figures were remembered. The actual texture of it. The night before a major engagement, the map spread on a table, the known information arranged on one side, and the unknowns arranged more uncomfortably on the other. The weight of responsibility for other people's lives. The need to make a decision, knowing that the decision was irreversible once made. That whatever happened next would happen as a consequence of this choice. He thought about this for a long time, alone at his table with the candle burning down. What made a person able to carry that? What was the quality that distinguished the commanders he read about from the men who served under them? Not physical courage, not necessarily, but something else, something more interior. The ability to hold uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. The capacity to make a decision in the presence of incomplete information and then commit to it fully, to act on it without the luxury of revision. He did not have a name for this quality. He simply recognized it when he saw it in the histories. and he noticed when it was absent. He took paper and drew maps. This was something that had begun on Corsica and continued here, the practice of making marks on paper that corresponded to the geography of places he had read about or imagined. It was not quite art, and not quite analysis. It was something in between, a way of thinking with his hands, of making abstract information concrete by giving it spatial form. He liked maps for the same reason he had liked looking at the sea. Both offered the experience of scale, of understanding yourself as a small thing within a large space, which sounds diminishing, but is in fact the opposite. To understand your position within a larger geography is to understand that position with precision. The map doesn't make you smaller. It makes your location more exact. He would copy maps from books and then extend them, filling in what was known, and then, at the edges, speculating about what might be there based on what he understood about geography, about how rivers and mountains shaped the land, about how populations organized themselves in relation to resources and defensible positions. This was not an assignment. No teacher had asked him to do it. He did it because he found it genuinely interesting, which is a different kind of motivation and produces a different quality of engagement. The other boys sometimes found this strange. He was aware, with the clear-eyed awareness of a child who pays attention, that he did not quite fit the social texture of the school. He was Corsican, which meant he was not quite French, in the way that the other boys were French. Not in language, not in cultural reference, not in the assumed commonality of background that allows people from similar places to skip past certain kinds of explanation. He spoke differently, thought differently, had grown up with different landscapes inside him. Some of the boys were friendly. Some were not particularly interested. Some found his quiet intensity off-putting. He was not unfriendly, but he was not easy to read. And people who are not easy to read sometimes make others uncomfortable by reflecting back to them the inadequacy of their own attention. None of this troubled him very much. He was not indifferent to belonging. He was human, and humans are not indifferent to belonging. But he was willing to belong on terms that were genuinely his, rather than performed for acceptance. He would not become less serious than he was, less focused, less interested in the things he was interested in order to be more legible to people who preferred a different register. He simply went his own way, steadily, without drama, without the kind of conspicuous individuality that draws attention to itself. He was not trying to be remarkable. He was trying to understand things. And understanding, in his experience, required patience and the willingness to remain with a question longer than was comfortable. The weeks became months. And with the passage of time, the things that had been difficult gradually became less so. Language first. The French of his classmates stopped being something he had to consciously decode and began to be something he simply understood, the way you understand your own thoughts, automatically, without translation. The particular idioms, the rhythms of conversation, the humor that depends on shared reference. All of it became accessible in the way that things become accessible through sustained immersion, through the daily accumulation of small encounters that each add a small increment of familiarity. Then the academic work, which had been demanding partly because of the language barrier, and partly because the military curriculum was genuinely rigorous. Mathematics, which he loved, in which he had always been strong, in which the language barrier mattered least because numbers are numbers in any tongue, became a domain where he began to distinguish himself clearly. The spatial reasoning that map drawing had cultivated translated directly into geometry, into the calculation of trajectories and distances that military education required. Teachers began to notice. Not with fanfare. The institution was not organized around fanfare, but he could see it in the quality of attention that certain teachers brought to his work, in the questions they asked that were different from the questions they asked others, that assumed a higher level of engagement and were therefore more interesting to answer. He did not pursue this recognition. It was not the point. The point was understanding. He wanted to know how things worked, not just the mechanics of military strategy, which was the school's explicit subject, but the deeper questions underneath. How decisions propagate through organizations, how small choices accumulate into large consequences, how the geography of a place shapes the history that happens within it, how people follow and why, what quality in a leader produces the willingness in others to trust their lives to another's judgment. These questions were not on any syllabus. He pursued them because they were interesting, and because something in him understood, without being able to articulate it clearly, that these were the questions that mattered. Late one evening, when the candle had burned most of the way down, and the room had settled into its nighttime quiet, he closed the book he had been reading and sat for a moment without moving. The other boys were asleep, or nearly so. The building around him had taken on the particular quality of silence that large stone structures develop at night. Heavy, permanent, indifferent to the lives happening within them. He was not thinking about anything specific. This happened sometimes. A gap between thoughts, a moment of genuine emptiness that was not uncomfortable, but simply present. The candle flame moved slightly, sending shadows across the wall, and he watched it without purpose, without trying to make anything of it. And in that watching, something settled. A feeling he didn't have precise words for. A sense that the arrangement of things was correct. Not in the sense that everything was good or easy or resolved, but in the deeper sense that he was where he should be, doing what he should be doing, moving in a direction that was genuinely his. The strangeness of this place had not disappeared. He still carried Corsica inside him. The smell of it, the sound of the sea, the particular quality of light on the water in the early morning. He would always carry it. It was not something that distance erased, but it had become possible to carry it and also to be here, in this room, in this institution, in this country that was not quite yet his, but was becoming so. He got up and went to the window. The French sky was different from the Corsican sky. Fewer stars visible through the thicker air, the horizon not the clean line of ocean, but the irregular shapes of rooftops and trees. But the stars that were visible were the same stars, the same points of light that had looked down on his hill in Corsica, looked down on this courtyard in France. The same universe, seen from a different position. He stood at the window for a long time, not thinking about the future, not making plans, not rehearsing ambitions, simply standing in the quiet of late evening, breathing the cool French air, feeling the particular peace that comes when you have done the day's work honestly and have nothing left to prove to anyone, including yourself. The candle behind him burned down to its end. The room went dark. He remained at the window a little longer. Then he turned, found his bed in the darkness, and lay down. The stars continued outside, indifferent and permanent. And in the room where a Corsican boy was becoming, slowly and by his own effort, someone else as well. Someone forged from two places and two languages, and the particular qualities that emerge from living at the intersection of things that don't quite fit. The silence was complete. He was not yet what he would become. He was only what he was. A student in a room under an infinite sky. But the direction was set, and in the morning he would continue, steadily, without hurry, step by step. Imagine an early morning, not on an island, not in a school, somewhere else entirely, out in the open, where the sky is wide and the air carries the smell of horses and damp earth and wood smoke from fires lit before dawn. The sun has not yet appeared. The horizon holds a thin line of grey-blue light that is not quite darkness and not quite day, the particular colour of the world in the minutes before it commits to morning. Everything is still and cool and waiting. And somewhere in this early light, among new roads and new responsibilities, Napoleon Bonaparte begins the next chapter of his life. He is no longer a student. He is an officer. The change was real, but it had not arrived as a single moment. There was no morning on which he woke up different. There was only the gradual accumulation of new weight, new authority, new obligation, the particular gravity of being responsible for other people rather than only for yourself. He had been commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery in 1785, at 16. The artillery suited him. It was the branch of military service most dependent on mathematics, on precise calculation, on the ability to understand space and distance and the behavior of objects moving through air. It rewarded the kind of intelligence he had been developing since he first traced map lines with his finger as a child. Spatial, analytical, comfortable with abstraction and its practical application. But the artillery also required something beyond intelligence, It required the ability to make decisions under pressure, to hold a plan in your mind while circumstances changed around it, to communicate clearly, and be obeyed without the luxury of lengthy explanation. These things he was still learning. Every officer is, at first, still learning them. The mornings began early. This was the first and most consistent fact of military life, the fact around which everything else organized itself. Before the light was fully established, before most of the world had made its peace with being awake, there was already movement in the camp. Footsteps on hard ground, voices low and purposeful, the sounds of an organization coming to order. Napoleon moved through these mornings with the same quality of attention he had always brought to new environments. He did not rush to speak. He listened first, watched first, built his understanding of a situation before contributing to it. This was temperament as much as strategy. He had always been this way, from the first days in the French school, when he had stood in an unfamiliar world and chosen silence over premature speech. He noticed things, the way a group of men moved, whether they were cohesive or loose, whether their attention was engaged or merely performed. The way authority was distributed in practice, which was often different from how it was distributed on paper. The small inefficiencies that accumulated over a day, and how they might be reduced. The moments when a decision was needed, and the person who should have made it hesitated. He noticed these things and filed them, not with immediate intention. He was not calculating in the transactional sense, not storing observations for future use in any deliberate way. He noticed because he was constitutionally unable not to notice, because his mind moved toward pattern and structure the way water moves toward lower ground. The maps were different now. He still worked with them in the evenings, spreading them across whatever surface was available, and studying them with the focused attention of someone for whom this was genuinely pleasurable rather than obligatory. But they were different from the maps of his school days. Those had been representations of places he had never been, abstractions, however detailed, that corresponded to nothing in his direct experience. These maps corresponded to roads he had traveled, terrain he had crossed, positions he had stood in and looked out from. The lines on the paper connected to physical memories. The slope of a particular hillside, the way a river widened as it approached a crossing point, the sight lines available from an elevated position. The map and the territory were beginning to fuse in his mind, becoming a single integrated thing, rather than two separate systems. He would run his finger along a route and understand it kinetically, not just as information about the relationship between points, but as a felt sense of what that movement would cost, how long it would take, where the difficulties lay, and where the advantages might be found. This was a different kind of knowledge than anything books had given him. It was knowledge that lived in the body as well as the mind, that required the actual experience of being in places to become fully real. He was grateful for it. There were long days on the road, and longer days of waiting. The waiting was something he had not expected to be as significant as it was. Military life had a rhythm that was nothing like the steady routine of the academy. It moved in surges and pauses, periods of intense activity, followed by periods in which nothing happened, and readiness had to be maintained anyway. Attention kept sharp against the possibility that the pause might end at any moment. He had thought he would find the waiting difficult. He had always been internally active. His mind was rarely still, and stillness imposed from outside had sometimes felt like confinement. But he discovered something in the long hours of waiting. Not that stillness was comfortable. It still wasn't, not exactly. But that it was useful. That the mind, when denied the stimulation of activity, turned more fully toward the problems available to it. That the quality of thinking possible in a quiet hour of waiting was different from the quality of thinking possible in motion. Deeper, less reactive, more capable of working through implications. He began to use the waiting deliberately. He would stand at the edge of whatever ground they occupied and look out at the landscape, fields, roads, the distant shapes of hills and towns, and he would think through scenarios, not fantasies, practical problems. If a force were positioned there, what options would it have? If the weather changed in this way, how would it affect movement along that road? If information arrived that changed a key assumption, what would need to be reconsidered? And how quickly? He thought through these problems slowly, methodically, without the pressure of actual decision-making. And in thinking through them in advance, in the quiet of a long afternoon with nothing else pressing, he found that when similar problems arrived in real conditions, under pressure, with time constraints and incomplete information, his mind moved through them more quickly. The paths had been partially worn in advance. The first real successes were quiet ones. They arrived not as dramatic moments, but as the gradual accumulation of small recognitions. A decision that proved correct, a preparation that turned out to be necessary, a reading of a situation that was more accurate than alternatives that had been proposed. People began to notice. Not loudly, not in the way that fame announces itself, in the quieter way that competence gets noticed in organizations where results matter. A slight increase in the quality of attention that superiors brought to his reports. A willingness among peers to hear his assessment of a problem before forming their own. He did not pursue this recognition. It was not, in itself, what he was working toward. He was working toward understanding, the same thing he had always been working toward, the same deep desire to comprehend how things worked, why they worked that way, and what could be changed. The recognition was a byproduct, evidence that the direction was right. He remained through all of it, essentially the same, contained, observant, careful with words. Not cold. He was genuinely warm with people he trusted, capable of real loyalty and real affection. But not expansive either. Not given to the kind of easy sociability that makes people instantly comfortable and costs nothing. He had decided, somewhere along the way, that he would rather be understood by few people truly than by many people superficially. This was partly temperament and partly conviction. He believed, and his reading of history had reinforced this, that the quality of a person's inner life, the discipline of their thinking, the honesty of their self-assessment, were the foundations on which everything external was eventually built. A person who knew themselves clearly, who could see a situation without the distortions of vanity or fear, who could make a decision and commit to it without being consumed by the need for it to have been the right one. That person had the only real advantage that mattered. Everything else was circumstance. One evening, after a day that had been long in the particular way that days are long when they contain many small demands rather than one large one, he sat outside as the light faded. The sky moved through its familiar sequence. Blue to gold, gold to amber, amber to the deep colors that precede dark. And then the stars, tentative at first, then confident, then everywhere. He had watched this sequence many times now, in many different places. On his hill in Corsica, from the window of his room at the academy, from various positions in the field. The sky above each of these places had been different in its particular details. Different humidity, different horizon, different surrounding landscape, giving context to the darkness. But the stars themselves were the same. This was something he returned to in quiet moments. The constancy of it. The world changed. Places, people, circumstances, the conditions of daily life, with a speed that was sometimes hard to absorb. But the stars continued. They had been there before any of this began, and they would be there after it concluded. Whatever happened in the human world below them, they maintained their patient indifference. He found this not diminishing, but stabilizing, a fixed point against which to measure everything else. He breathed in the night air, let the day's accumulated tension release with the exhale, the minor frustrations, the things that hadn't gone exactly as planned, the questions that remained unresolved. He was somewhere in the middle of things. Not at the beginning. Too much had already happened. Too much had already been learned and experienced and incorporated for it to feel like a beginning. But clearly not at the end either. What lay ahead was still largely unknown, still largely unformed, still a horizon rather than a destination, somewhere in the middle, moving forward, one step at a time. He looked at the stars for a long time. Then he stood, stretched, and turned back toward the lamplight. There was more to do tomorrow. There was always more to do tomorrow. And that, he had come to understand, was not a burden, but a fact. The basic fact of a life engaged with the world, which always presents more than can be resolved in a single day, which always asks more than can be given before rest becomes necessary. He was not impatient with this. He had learned, somewhere between the island and the school and the road, that the useful relationship to the future is not anxious anticipation, but steady preparation. The daily work of becoming more capable, more clear-sighted, more able to act well when action is required. The path was long. He was on it. That was enough for tonight. Imagine a day that begins like any other. the sun lifts itself above the horizon in the unhurried way it always has, indifferent to what the day will contain, indifferent to the weight of the decisions that will be made beneath it. The light falls across the ground softly, touching everything with the same impartiality. The maps on the table, the roads outside, the faces of the men who are already moving through the early morning with purpose. Napoleon wakes before most of them. He lies still for a moment after opening his eyes, not from fatigue, not from reluctance to begin, from habit, from the practice cultivated over years of allowing himself 1 minute of genuine quiet before the day begins to make its demands. In that minute, he listens, not to the sounds outside, which are already beginning. Boots on hard ground, distant voices, the particular organized noise of many people doing coordinated things. He listens inward, to the quality of his own stillness. It has always been there, since Corsica, since the hill above the sea, since the early mornings when he stood at the window and watched the world wake up before anyone else in the house had opened their eyes. A kind of interior quiet that exists independently of exterior circumstances, that persists even now, when the exterior circumstances have become considerably more complex than they were for a boy on an island. He breathes, once, deliberately. Then he rises and begins. His name is known now in ways it was not before. This had happened gradually, as most real things happen. Not in a single moment of recognition, but through the slow accumulation of demonstrated competence, of decisions that proved correct, of situations handled in ways that other people noticed and remembered. His name appeared in dispatches, in conversations among officers, in the reports that moved up through the hierarchy of an army that was itself moving through a period of extraordinary upheaval. He was aware of this. He would have been foolish not to be. And he was not foolish. But his relationship to it was simpler than people might have expected. Recognition was useful insofar as it translated into the ability to act, to have decisions trusted, to have resources allocated, to move events in directions that seemed correct. As an end in itself, it interested him less than it seemed to interest most people. He had watched enough men become invested in their own reputation to understand that reputation is a poor guide for decision-making. It pulls toward the impressive over the effective, toward the dramatic over the sound. He preferred to start each morning the same way, regardless of what the previous day had brought. Not out of false modesty. He knew clearly what he was capable of, and did not pretend otherwise, but because the quality of his work depended on the quality of his attention, and the quality of his attention depended on his ability to arrive at each new situation without the weight of yesterday's judgments distorting what he saw. Each morning, the same quiet minute, the same breath, the same willingness to begin. The maps had become something different from what they had once been. As a child, they had been imagination, lines on paper that corresponded to places he had never been, that opened into possibility the way the horizon opens when you stand above it. As a student, they had been intellect, problems in spatial reasoning, exercises in understanding how geography shapes the movement of forces. As a young officer, they had been learning the slow process of matching the paper to the physical world, of building the internal map that allows a commander to navigate not just from point to point, but with a felt sense of the whole. Now they were responsibility. Every line corresponded to real ground over which real people would move. Every route had a cost, in time, in energy, in exposure to risk. Every decision made over a map translated into consequences that unfolded in the world, that were experienced by people who had no part in making the decision and bore its results regardless. He did not find this paralyzing. He found it clarifying. He would stand over a map and trace a route with one finger, not moving quickly, not performing decisiveness for anyone watching, simply thinking, following the logic of the terrain through its implications, checking each assumption against what he knew, and each conclusion against what he expected, looking for the place where his reasoning might be wrong. The hardest skill he had developed, harder than the mathematics, harder than the tactics, harder than any of the technical knowledge the academy had given him, was the ability to look for where he was wrong, to bring the same quality of attention to the weaknesses of his own plans as he brought to identifying the weaknesses of others, to hold his conclusions loosely enough that new information could actually change them. This was harder than it sounds. The mind that has worked through a problem and arrived at a solution wants to protect that solution. It reads new information as confirmation when it can, and dismisses it as irrelevant when it cannot. The discipline required to keep the solution genuinely provisional, to remain actually open rather than performing openness, was something he had to practice deliberately every time without becoming complacent about it. In the silence before a decision, he would sometimes simply stop. Let the map be what it was. Let the situation be what it was. And wait, not impatiently, but genuinely, for the understanding to settle into clarity. It usually did. Not always immediately. Not always in time to be comfortable. But the understanding came, and it was more trustworthy for having been allowed to arrive rather than forced. The difficult evenings were not the ones after defeats. Defeats had their own clarity. Something had gone wrong, and the task was to understand what, and to ensure that it did not go wrong in the same way again. This was painful work, but it was work. It had direction and purpose. The difficult evenings were the ones before large decisions, when everything that could be prepared had been prepared, when the information available had been examined as thoroughly as it could be, and what remained was simply the decision itself, the moment of commitment after which the situation would unfold in one direction rather than another, and nothing could be taken back. On such evenings, he would sometimes go outside, stand in the open air, away from the maps and the preparations and the people who needed things from him, and look at the distance, fields, roads, the shapes of hills against a darkening sky, the particular landscape of wherever he happened to be, which was never the landscape of his childhood, but which always had the quality of being simply the world, simply there, continuing without reference to the problems he was carrying. He allowed himself, in these moments, to remember Corsica, not indulgently, not as escape or as nostalgia, more as a kind of calibration. The boy who had sat on the hill and watched the sea had been before all of this, before the decisions and the responsibilities and the weight of other people's expectations. He had been simply himself, in a place he loved, with the whole future still undetermined. That person still existed inside him, was still, in some fundamental sense, who he was. The layers of experience and authority and acquired capability had not replaced him, but accumulated around him, the way rings accumulate around the core of a tree, without changing what the tree essentially is. Remembering this was useful. It reminded him that the decisions were made by him, by a specific person with a specific history and a specific set of values, rather than by a role or a position or an expectation. It brought him back to himself. Then he let the memory go and returned to the present. The victories, when they came, he received quietly. This surprised people sometimes. They expected something more expansive, the kind of elation that large successes are supposed to produce, the visible release of tension that everyone around him seemed to feel and express. He felt it too, in his way. But his way was interior, brief, and quickly resolved into the next question, because the next question was always already there. What had worked, and why? What had not worked, or had worked less well than it might have? What did this outcome change about the situation going forward? And what remained unchanged? What had he learned that could be applied? And what had he learned that suggested he had been wrong about something he thought he understood? He was incapable of treating a success as a conclusion. It was always, instead, a data point, important, welcome, but embedded in a continuing process that the success itself did not resolve. This was not inability to enjoy. He did enjoy the satisfaction of a plan executed well, of a difficult problem solved, of evidence that the work had been done correctly. But the enjoyment was clean and brief. And then it was over. And the next thing was there. He had accepted, somewhere in his development, that this was simply how his mind worked. Some people are built for arrival. He was built for movement. The destination, when reached, immediately became the departure point for the next one. This was not restlessness. It was the shape of his engagement with the world. One evening, after a day that had asked much and given much in return, he sat outside under a sky going from amber to deep blue. The stars appeared in their usual sequence. First one, then several, then the whole familiar arrangement spreading across the darkening sky. He had seen this from so many places now. Corsica, France, across the country and beyond it. Different latitudes, different surrounding landscapes, different conditions. But the sky itself had a consistency that nothing else quite had. The same configurations, patient and permanent, returning every clear night regardless of what had happened below them. He breathed in the night air, felt the day's weight begin to release. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. The decisions made today were made. Whatever they produced, they would produce. There was nothing more to be done about them tonight that could not better be done tomorrow. With rest behind him, he had done what the day required. That was enough. Not more, not faster, not in some improved version of himself that didn't exist yet. Simply what the day required, done as well as he could do it, with the attention and the care and the judgment he had developed over all the years of study and practice that had brought him here. It was sufficient. He closed his eyes. In the brief pause that followed, the pause between the day completed and the night that would restore him for the next one, there was something that he recognized from childhood, from the hill, from the evenings when the island had seemed to breathe around him, and the stars had filled the sky, and there had been nothing required of him except to be present. The path was not made of peaks. It was made of all the moments between them, the mornings and the evenings, the preparations and the waiting, the long hours of work that were neither dramatic nor memorable, but that made everything else possible. It was made of the quality of attention he brought to the maps, and the quality of stillness he maintained in the minutes before the day began. It was made of this breath, this sky, this particular evening, unremarkable in itself, part of the ordinary accumulation that constituted a life. He sat with it for a while. Then he rose, turned back toward the light, and went inside. Tomorrow was already waiting. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to islands far from everything, not the silence of a place that has never been loud, that is simply emptiness, the absence of sound in a space where sound was never expected. This is a different silence, the silence of a person who was once at the center of the loudest events in the world, and who now finds themselves somewhere very far from all of it, with only the ocean in every direction, and the wind moving through the grass on the hillside, and the sound of their own breathing in a quiet room. St. Helena sits in the South Atlantic, approximately halfway between the coast of Africa and the coast of South America. It is small, about 10 miles long, less across, and volcanic in origin, rising steeply from the ocean, in the dramatic way that islands formed from the seafloor tend to rise. From certain points on the island, the horizon is visible in every direction, an unbroken circle of water meeting sky. The nearest landmass of any significance is roughly 1,000 miles away. Napoleon arrived here in October of 1815. He was 45 years old. The house where he lived was called Longwood. It was not unsuitable, exactly. It had rooms enough, and a small surrounding property that allowed for walks. But it was damp, because the island's climate was damp, subject to frequent fogs and winds that came off the ocean, carrying moisture that seemed to settle into the walls and the furniture and the air of every enclosed space. The climate was not quite cold, but never quite warm. in the way that the Mediterranean climates of his childhood and his years of campaigning had been warm. It had the slightly oppressive quality of weather that is never quite what you would choose. The mornings began as mornings do, the light coming first, then the sounds. But the sounds were different from anything he had spent his adult life surrounded by. No drums, no horses, no organized movement of large numbers of people. Only the wind, which was almost constant, and the birds, and occasionally rain on the roof, and the quieter sounds of a small household engaged in its domestic routines. He woke early, as he always had, and lay still for a moment in the early light of a room on an island in the middle of the South Atlantic, listening to the particular silence of a life that had become, after everything, very quiet. The days had a structure, because structure was something he had always imposed on his time, and the habit did not leave him simply because the circumstances had changed. He rose, he ate, he walked when the weather permitted, and his health allowed. He talked with the small group of people who had come with him into exile, officers who had chosen to follow, attendants, the handful of companions who constituted his world now that his world had contracted to the dimensions of this island. He dictated. This became, gradually, the primary occupation of his days. The project of recording his own life and the events he had been part of setting down his account while it was still available to him, while the memory of it was still detailed enough to be rendered with specificity. He would talk for hours sometimes, and his companions would write, and the words accumulated into volumes that were a form of conversation with a future he would not be present to inhabit. He thought carefully about how to tell it. Not dishonestly, or not entirely, but with the awareness that the telling of history is an act of interpretation, that the same sequence of events can be arranged to point in different directions, that the account a person leaves of their own life is never simply a record, but always also an argument. He understood this because he had understood it all his life, had understood from his early reading of histories that the men who wrote them were always present in what they wrote, always shaping the material, even when they believed themselves to be merely transmitting it. He was shaping it too. He knew this, and he allowed himself to do it, not because he had no conscience about it, but because he believed, sincerely, that certain things were true, and that the record should reflect them. He had changed Europe. This was not vanity. It was simply accurate. The codes of law that bore his name, the administrative structures he had built, the principle that advancement could be earned by merit rather than inherited by birth, these things persisted after him, and would continue to persist. Whatever the verdict on the man, the structures remained. He wanted the record to reflect what the structures had meant, and what they had been intended to mean. The conversations with the officers were different from the dictation. In the dictation, he was constructing something. In the conversations, he was simply living inside the past for a while, returning to it the way you return to a place you once knew well, finding what had changed and what remained. understanding things now that had only been experienced then. They would sit in the evenings and talk about campaigns that were years behind them, the roads they had traveled, the decisions made at specific moments in specific weather conditions with specific information available. Sometimes he remembered a detail with vivid precision, the exact positioning of forces at a particular moment, the quality of light on a particular afternoon, the face of a particular officer at a moment of decision. Sometimes he found that what had seemed clear at the time was less clear in retrospect, that decisions he had been certain of then looked different now, when the consequences were known, and the assumptions that had underlain them could be examined in the light of what had actually happened. He was not, in these conversations, defending himself. He was trying to understand. This was genuine, more genuine, perhaps, than anything he had done publicly with the question of his own life. In private, among people he trusted, there was no audience to perform for. There was only the question: what had happened, and why, and what should be understood about it? He found that the further back he went, the more clearly he could see certain things. The early decisions, made from a position of less power, and therefore of clearer constraint, often looked more obviously correct than decisions made later, from positions of greater power that had brought their own distortions. The expansion of authority, he could see now, had brought with it an expansion of the space in which error was possible, of the distance between intention and consequence, of the ways in which the information that reached him had been filtered by the people who delivered it. He had known this abstractly while it was happening, but knowing something abstractly while inside it is different from understanding it fully from outside. From outside, on an island in the South Atlantic, with nothing left to decide, and no one to manage the information he received, he could see more clearly. It was, in its way, an education. His health declined slowly. The damp climate did not help, nor did the constriction of an active man to a small space after a lifetime of movement. He had never been sedentary. His body had always been engaged, responsive to the physical demands of campaign life. Now the demands were few, and the body, deprived of its accustomed work, began its own slow withdrawal. He spent more time in the house as the months and then the years passed, more time in the chair by the window, looking out at the ocean, more time inside his own memories, which remained vivid and detailed, and which became increasingly the primary landscape he inhabited. The ocean outside was always there. On clear days, it was brilliant and vast, the blue of deep water in full sun, the horizon impossibly sharp. On overcast days, it was grey and flat, and seemed to press inward, to reduce the visible world to the island, and the water immediately surrounding it, and the heavy sky above. In storms, it became something else entirely, violent and emphatic, waves breaking against the cliffs below, with a sound he could sometimes hear from inside the house. The sea asserting itself in the way that the sea periodically asserts itself against anything built at its edges. He watched it all without judgment. The sea had been there before him. It would be there after. It did not care what had happened on the European continent between 1796 and 1815, did not distinguish between victories and defeats, did not have a view on the question of whether the life he had lived had been well lived. There was something restful about this indifference, finally. He thought about Corsica. Not constantly. He was too present a person for prolonged nostalgic retreat, too engaged with the actual texture of each day to spend it entirely in the past. But the island came back to him in quiet moments, in the early mornings when the light was soft, and the day had not yet fully begun. The hill above the sea, the smell of the morning air, which was nothing like the air here, warmer, richer, carrying the particular combination of salt and herbs and warm stone that was the smell of that specific place on earth. The sound of the waves at night, which he had heard through his childhood bedroom window, and which had been the background of his earliest self. He had been a boy on that hill, simply a boy, looking at a horizon, wondering about the world beyond it. Nothing had been decided yet. The life that followed, all of it, the campaigns and the governance and the rise and the catastrophic fall and the exile and this room and this ocean, had been invisible from that hill, as unimaginable to that boy as the specific shape of a life ever is to the person who will eventually live it. He had wondered about what lay beyond the horizon. He had found out. He let the memory be what it was, present, warm, irrecoverable, and then he let it go, the way he had always let things so when holding them served no further purpose. The past was the past. It had made him, and he had made it. And now it was complete. A structure that could be examined but not altered. He returned his attention to the window, to the ocean, to the present. Which was this? On the 5th of May, 1821, on the island of St. Helena, Napoleon Bonaparte died. He was 51 years old. The ocean continued outside the windows of Longwood, indifferent and permanent, as it had been on the first day he arrived, and would be long after the house itself was gone. What persists of a life is always a matter of selection, of what is carried forward and what is allowed to dissolve. His name persisted, attached to an enormous range of things. The legal codes, the administrative systems, the memory of battles won and lost, the image of a small man in a hat who had believed so completely in his own capacity to shape events that the belief had itself become a force in the world. But underneath all of that, behind the image and the name and the accumulated judgments of history, there had been a person. A boy who woke before dawn on a Mediterranean island and stood at the window watching the world change color in the early light, who traced map lines with his finger and wondered what lay beyond the edges of the page, who sat under stars that looked the same from every place he ever lived, and found in their constancy something that the turbulence of his own life could not disturb. That person had been present through all of it, through the rise and the command and the glory and the failure and the long quiet of the final years, had remained beneath the roles and the titles simply himself, someone who paid attention, who worked carefully, who believed that the quality of a decision depended on the quality of the thinking behind it, who had found in stillness from his earliest years the ground on which everything else was built. The path had been extraordinary in its shape, unprecedented in its reach, but it had been walked step by step in the same way that all paths are walked, one day at a time, one decision at a time, in the small hours of ordinary mornings that contained, as all ordinary mornings do, the whole of what a person is and the whole of what they might yet become. The ocean moved outside. The stars appeared above the island as they always had, and the silence that settled was not empty. It was complete